was going to say this is the first time I've ever prosecuted. But it's not true, because actually I also prosecuted in the Permanent Peoples Tribunal in 1994 the rights of violations of the rights of asylum seekers. Okay, so members of the jury, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. You probably recognise those words. Words carved on the Statue of Liberty in the harbour of New York. Words carved, of course, by the descendants of European immigrants who built the country on the basis of extermination and slavery. So the words were addressed to a very specific group of people, European migrants seeking freedom, yearning to be free, yearning to make a better life for themselves. European migrants spread all over the world, armed with Bibles, with opium, with slaves, and with guns. Over the centuries, establishing and perfecting a global system which sucked the wealth, the resources out of the global south, oil out of the Middle East, precious metals and gemstones, foodstuffs, sugar, rice, coffee, from Africa, Asia, Latin America. The liberation and independence movements initiated by the subject peoples of the globe brought in their train new forms of slavery and colonialism and exploitation. The rich world has locked those countries into debt and dependency with their development policies, which are marked by systemic corruption, with their arms trade, with the destruction of the environment, with the destruction of traditional livelihoods, which of course causes conflict. It causes food riots, it causes repression, it causes displacement. So when those peoples, the migrant and refugee peoples, displaced by those global processes, seek a better life, seek safety, seek security, in the rich world which has displaced them, they do not get the welcome that is carved on the Statue of Liberty. The tribunals in Palermo, Barcelona and Paris have heard about the welcomes given, and you know, members of the jury, you know about the migrant boats destroyed, the rescue boats of volunteers fired on, the captains and crews and volunteers trying to bring people to safety in Europe put under criminal investigation, prosecuted. The EU and its member states, the deals to prevent people leaving countries of persecution, countries of war, countries of slavery and torture, or to return to them those who have left. So those earlier tribunals have heard that side of the story. They've heard about the reception given in the camps, the unspeakable squalor, the neglect the neglect by the states, the way people are allowed to rot in the bottleneck camps throughout Europe as each country closes its borders, people sleeping in the streets, their makeshift homes being repeatedly destroyed, the beatings, the tear gas, and the criminalisation of volunteers who simply try to feed them and give them water and give them back a bit of human dignity. So that has been the subject of the earlier tribunals in Paris, Palermo, and Barcelona. And that is part of the hostile environment facing migrant and refugee peoples travelling to Europe. So today's hearing focuses on other aspects of that environment, but at the same time emphasising the continuity between those violations and the exclusion, the inhumanity and the impunity suffered by those migrants and refugees in the countries of the global north. Most of the focus obviously in the UK, but not exclusively. So the focus today and tomorrow is on the living and working conditions of migrants in the UK and in Europe, facing policies which deny rights to healthcare, rights to housing, to work, to welfare benefits, which subject them to arbitrary and indefinite detention, and which deprive them even of the means of challenging their treatment in court by the removal of legal aid. Policies which try to frighten them so they can't even send their children to school, so that they can't even seek or dare not even seek antenatal care. Policies which force landlords, employers, educational institutions, banks, etc., into unwilling collusion. Policies which create illegality by refusing to create legal routes of entry and stay to those who are not highly paid corporate employees, not part of the global elite. Policies which criminalise work. Although, when you think about it, both migration and worthwhile work are both fundamental attributes of what it is to be human. And both of those are criminalised. Policies which deny another fundamental attribute, which is the right to family life, through detention, deportation, and through income requirements, so that you can only have your family with you if you earn over a certain amount. Policies, in short, which respond not to human needs, but to the needs of the economy, to the perceived needs, electoral needs of politicians who want to show that they can be tough. Policies which treat migrants, and the words are there, like a tap, turn them on, turn them off, migrant flows. And if you read European Commission documents, for example, on civilian deaths in Afghanistan, for example, you see that the whole document is framed in terms of migration flows. And that gives you an indication of the way migrant and refugee peoples are perceived, and that perception informs policy. Policies such as these facilitate and normalise the super-exploitation of migrant and refugee peoples as disposable units of labour, sometimes in conditions akin to modern slavery. You'll hear over the next couple of days evidence from all sorts of sectors of employment, care, domestic work, warehousing, road transport and logistics, food and agricultural processing, both in the UK and Europe. And the governments of the EU and the global north present these policies, these treating people as units of labour, as disposable. They present their policies as rational responses to immigration, speaking in terms of a crisis of numbers, which of course is laughable when you look at the numbers of refugees and migrants circulating in the global south and given refuge in the global south. The governments of the EU and the global north deny any element of discrimination by race, gender or other status, but the language, the inhuman language that is used, is a giveaway. It's a language of floods, swarms, a language of natural disasters, language of insects and infestations. And that's the language used not just by rabble-rousing journalists, I can't even call them journalists, not just by rabble-rousers in the right-wing press, but by ministers who describe people in those terms. That language demonstrates the racism, the imperialist and colonial attitudes informing policy. At the heart of policy is a contempt for what are still seen as the lower races and the lower orders. Contempt informed both by race and by class. The commonality of experience of migrants and refugee peoples displaced from their homes by ravenous global capitalism, excluded and marginalised and exploited in the global north. That the commonality of that experience means that they can and should perhaps be seen to constitute a people for the purposes of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Peoples. The reason why the Permanent Peoples Tribunal has an apostrophe, sorry, I'm obsessed with grammar, has an apostrophe after the S and not before the S, is for that very reason, because we are looking at the peoples, not just people as individuals, but peoples as collectivities, and that is vitally important, both in terms of the indictment, the treatment, and the violation of rights, but also in terms of the solution to that. So it's the collectivity which informs the resistance. The Algiers Declaration, which I must admit I wasn't aware of until recently, provides that every people has a right to existence, that no one should be subjected because of his or her national or cultural identity to persecution, deportation, expulsion or living conditions such as may compromise the identity or integrity of the people to which he or she belongs. So that is the right of, the basic right of a people to exist and not to be persecuted or treated, subject to inhuman or degrading treatment. We will present evidence which demonstrates the systemic nature of the violations of the rights of migrant and refugee peoples. The UK, the EU and its member states have signed, ratified and sometimes drafted a vast number of human rights conventions over the past 70 years, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which will have its 70th anniversary this year. The universality of human rights is central, is vital, because once those human rights are seen as not universal, then they're no longer rights. They become privileges to be awarded to the deserving and not simply by virtue of a common humanity. And it's that retreat from the universality of human rights also which informs the indictment today. And the rights which we say are violated, which you will hear evidence, systematic violations of the rights to liberty, to freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment, to family life and private life, to an adequate standard of living, including the right to adequate housing without discrimination, the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health without discrimination, the right to work in just and favourable conditions, rights to education, and of course the right to dignity, the right to an effective remedy for violations of any of these rights. And at the heart of all these rights is the right to be treated without discrimination. You'll see that as usually the first article in these conventions is the right to equal treatment, that these rights should be for everybody without discrimination on grounds of race, nationality, ethnic origin, gender, sexuality or other status, birth or other status. So those are the rights which we say are systematically violated, amongst others. We suggest that the cumulative effect of all these violations amounts to a crime against humanity, defined by Article 7 of the Rome Statute as persecution against a group or a collective possessing their own identity, inspired by reasons of a political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious or gender-based nature, or other inhuman acts of the same nature aimed at intentionally causing grave suffering or serious prejudice to the physical integrity or physical or mental health. There's a whole long list of crimes which might constitute crimes against humanity. While the status of migrant and refugee peoples makes them uniquely vulnerable in terms of the lack of protection by the host state and the lack of status, subject to violations by host states on account of their status, the indictment also poses the question or the suggestion, which was touched on by Diana Holland, that migrants might also be considered as experimental subjects or guinea pigs for a broader destruction of rights under neoliberal globalisation. You need only look at the example of Greece, the way the austerity policies which were forced onto Greece, which hit the poorest hardest. The last, but in the UK and in the global north generally, the last decade or so has seen the rollback of workplace rights, in terms of 0 hours contracts, the manipulation of self-employed status, the result of deliberate policies of flexibilisation of the workforce across the global north, combined with austerity measures cutting benefits, forcing disabled people to work and resulting in a large number of deaths, increasing homelessness as the government is content to see housing as a commodity, as assets to be sold off to the global elites, abdicating responsibility for the housing, the rights and the welfare of citizens. So in the course of the next couple of days, you'll hear evidence of lives that have been damaged and destroyed. You'll also hear evidence of resistance, of courage, of solidarity. And the tribunal will be asked also to consider how those examples of resistance and solidarity can be built on as models for future action. So we want the tribunal not merely to condemn, but also to be part of building for the future where universality is put right back into human rights. So that's it. I think we're going to have a break and then we will start on the evidence. So thank you very much.